The dwarf thanked the fairy and said goodbye. He then threw the reins on his horse's neck and started up the hill. That seemed to grow bigger and bigger as he ascended, and the dwarf soon found that what he was looking for, a hill, was a great mountain. After traveling all the day, toiling up by steep crags and heathery passes, he reached the top as the sun was setting in the ocean, and he saw far below him, out in the waters, the island of the Mystic Lake. He began his descent to the shore, but long before he reached it, the sun had set, and darkness, unpierced by a single star, dropped upon the sea. The old horse, worn out by his long and painful journey, sank beneath him, and the dwarf was so tired that he rolled off his back and fell asleep by his side. He awoke at the breaking of the morning and saw that he was almost at the water's edge. He looked out to sea and saw the island, but nowhere could he see the water steeds, and he began to fear he must have taken a wrong course in the night, and that the island before him was not the one he was in search of. But even while he was so thinking, he heard fierce and angry snortings, and coming swiftly from the island to the shore, he saw the swimming and prancing steeds. Sometimes their heads and manes only were visible, and sometimes, rearing, they rose half out of the water, and striking it with their hooves, churned it into foam, and tossed the white spray to the skies. As they approached nearer and nearer, their snorting became more terrible, and their nostrils shot forth clouds of vapor. The dwarf trembled at the sight and sound, and his old horse, quivering in every limb, moaned piteously as if in pain. On came the steeds until they almost touched the shore. Then, rearing, they seemed about to spring onto it. The frightened dwarf turned his head to fly, and as he did so, he heard the twang of a golden harp. And right before him, who should he see but the little man of the hills, holding a harp in one hand and striking the strings with the other. "Are you ready to pay the price?" said he, nodding gaily to the dwarf. As he asked the question, the listening water steeds snorted more furiously than ever. "Are you ready to pay the price?" said the little man a second time. A shower of spray, tossed on shore by the angry steeds, drenched the dwarf to the skin and sent a cold shiver to his bones, and he was so terrified that he could not answer. "For the third and last time, are you ready to pay the price?" asked the fairy, as he flung the harp behind him and turned to depart. When the dwarf saw him going, he thought of the little princess and the lonely moor, and his courage came back, and he answered bravely, "Yes, I am ready." The water steeds, hearing his answer and snorting with rage, struck the shore with their pounding hoofs. "Back to your waves!" cried the little harper, and as he ran his fingers across his lyre, the frightened steeds drew back into the waters. "What is the price?" asked the dwarf. "Your right eye," said the fairy, and before the dwarf could say a word, the fairy scooped out the eye with his finger and put it into his pocket. The dwarf suffered most terrible agony, but he resolved to bear it for the sake of the little princess. Then the fairy sat down on a rock at the edge of the sea, and after striking a few notes, he began to play the strains of slumber. The sound crept along the waters, and the steeds, so ferocious a moment before, became perfectly still. They had no longer any motion of their own, and they floated on the top of the tide like foam before a breeze. "Now," said the fairy, as he led the dwarf's horse to the edge of the tide. The dwarf urged the horse into the water, and once out of his depth, the old horse struck out boldly for the island. The sleeping water steeds drifted helplessly against him, and in a short time he reached the island safely, and he neighed joyously as his hoofs touched solid ground. The dwarf rode on until he came to a bridle path, and following this, it led him up through winding lanes, bordered with golden firs that filled the air with fragrance, and brought him to the summit of the green hills that girdled and looked down on the mystic lake. Here the horse stopped of his own accord, and the dwarf's heart beat quickly as his eye rested on the lake, that, clipped round by the ring of hills, seemed in the breezeless and sunlit air as still as death and as bright as life can be. After gazing at it for a long time, he dismounted and lay at his ease in the pleasant grass. Hour after hour passed, but no change came over the face of the waters, and when the night fell, sleep closed the eyelids of the dwarf. The song of the lark awoke him in the early morning, and, starting up, he looked at the lake, but its wide waters were as bright as they had been the day before. Toward midday, he beheld what he thought was a black cloud sailing across the sky from east to west. It seemed to grow larger as it came nearer and nearer, and when it was high above the lake, he saw it was a huge bird, the shadow of whose outstretched wings darkened the waters of the lake. And the dwarf knew it was one of the cormorants of the western seas. As it descended slowly, he saw that it held in one of its claws a branch of a tree larger than a full-grown oak and laden with clusters of ripe red berries. It alighted at some distance from the dwarf, and after resting for a time, it began to eat the berries and to throw the stones into the lake, and wherever a stone fell, a bright red stain appeared in the water. As he looked more closely at the bird, the dwarf saw that it had all the signs of old age, and he could not help wondering how it was able to carry such a heavy tree. Later in the day, two other birds, as large as the first but younger, came up from the west and settled down beside him. They also ate the berries, and throwing the stones into the lake, it was soon as red as wine. When they had eaten all the berries, the young birds began to pick the decayed feathers off the old bird and to smooth his plumage. As soon as they had completed their task, he rose slowly from the hill and sailed out over the lake, and dropping down on the waters, dived beneath them. In a moment he came to the surface and shot up into the air with a joyous cry, and flew off to the west in all the vigor of renewed youth, followed by the other birds. When they had gone so far that they were like specks in the sky, the dwarf mounted his horse and descended toward the lake. He was almost at the margin, and in other minute would have plunged in, when he heard a fierce screaming in the air, and before he had time to look up, the three birds were hovering over the lake. The dwarf drew back, frightened. The birds wheeled over his head, and then swooping down, they flew close to the water, covering it with their wings and uttering harsh cries. Then, rising to a great height, they folded their wings and dropped headlong, like three rocks on the lake, crashing its surface and scattering a wine-red shower upon the hills. Then the dwarf remembered what the fairy told him, that if he attempted to swim the lake without paying the price, the three cormorants of the western seas would pick the flesh off his bones. He knew not what to do, and was about to turn away, when he heard once more the twang of the golden harp, and the little fairy of the hills stood before him. "Faint heart never won fair lady," said the little harper. "Are you ready to pay the price? The spear and shield are on the opposite bank, and the Princess Finola is crying this moment in the lonely moor." At the mention of Finola's name, the dwarf's heart grew strong. "Yes," he said, "I am ready, win or die. What is the price?" "Your left eye," said the fairy, and as soon as he said it, he scooped out the eye and put it in his pocket. The poor blind dwarf almost fainted with pain. "It's your last trial," said the fairy, "and now do what I tell you. Twist your horse's mane round your right hand and I will lead him to the water. Plunge in and fear not. I gave you back your speech. When you reach the opposite bank, you will get back your memory, and you will know who and what you are." Then the fairy led the horse to the margin of the lake. "In with you now, and good luck go with you," said the fairy. The dwarf urged the horse. He plunged into the lake and went down and down until his feet struck the bottom. Then he began to ascend, and as he came near the surface of the water, the dwarf thought he saw a glimmering light. And when he rose above the water, he saw the bright sun shining and the green hills before him, and he shouted with joy at finding his sight restored. But he saw more. Instead of the old horse he had ridden into the lake, he was bestride a noble steed, and as the steed swam to the bank, the dwarf felt a change coming over himself, and an unknown vigor in his limbs. When the steed touched the shore, he galloped up the hillside, and on the top of the hill was a silver shield, bright as the sun, resting against the spear standing upright in the ground. The dwarf jumped off, and running toward the shield, he saw himself as in a looking-glass. He was no longer a dwarf, but a gallant knight. At the moment, his memory came back to him, and he knew he was Connell, one of the knights of the Red Branch, and he remembered now that spell of dumbness and deformity had been cast upon him by the witch of the palace of the quickened trees. Slinging his shield off his left arm, he plucked the spear from the ground and leaped onto his horse. With a light heart, he swam back over the lake, and nowhere could he see the black cormorants of the western sea, but 3 white swans floating abreast, following him to the bank. When he reached the bank, he galloped down to the sea and crossed to the shore. Then he flung the reins upon the horse's neck, and swifter than the wind the gallant horse swept on, and it was not long before he was bounding over the enchanted moor. Wherever his hoofs struck the ground, grass and flowers sprang up, and great trees with leafy branches rose on every side. At last the knight reached the little hut. 3 times he struck the shield with the haft, and 3 times with the blade of his spear. At the last blow, the hut disappeared, and standing before him was the little princess. The knight took her in his arms and kissed her. Then he lifted her onto the horse, and leaping up before her, he turned towards the north, to the palace of the Red Branch Knights, and as they rode on beneath the leafy trees, from every tree the birds sang out, for the spell of silence over the lonely moor was broken forever. Well, that was our first story from Edmund Leamy's Irish Fairy Tales. We'll be back again with another one. Hope you enjoyed that, and be sure to check in for more stories from the Eoin McKiernan Library's virtual Celtic Junction Story Hour. My name is Jim Tarbox. We'll see you again.